Is Julie Rose, and I'm the Historic House Manager at Marietta House Museum. I'd like to introduce Stacy Hawkins, Marietta's Program Coordinator, who's monitoring the chat today. We're thrilled to welcome over 80 attendees to today's program. Thank you so much for joining us. Before we get started, I'd like to share a few housekeeping items with you. We're recording the first half of this afternoon's program, which includes a 20-minute video clip, and then in the second portion, a 7-minute video clip. Following the conversation with Dr. Adams and Dr. Kearse, the second half of the program is a Q&A portion, and that part will not be recorded. Your participation is really an important part of today's program. We encourage you to meet our speakers and talk with them in the Q&A portion about giving voice to long silenced people from history. Please feel free to ask questions in the chat or by raising your hand during the second half of the program. When you want to talk during the Q&A, click the raise your hand icon, and Stacy will let the guest speakers know you're ready to comment. When Stacy acknowledges you, you'll need to turn on your microphone by clicking the speaker icon in the bottom bar to unmute yourself. During the program, please feel free to write comments and questions in the chat box, or to let us know if you can't hear or see something. Please check that your microphone is on mute when you're not speaking. That helps minimize the outside noise. You can also choose to have your camera on or off, though we'd love to see your faces if you choose. Marietta House Museum acknowledges the history and continued traditions of the Piscataway Conoy tribe, who hunted, farmed, and lived on this land long before Marietta House was built. As we consider the history of this place, take a moment to remember the many people who were forced to leave their traditional homes. Marietta is part of Prince George's County Parks and Recreation in the Natural and Historical Resources Division, also known as NERD, and part of the Maryland National Capital Parks and Planning Commission. Located in the Glendale community, Marietta is a nationally recognized landmark. Today, the historic building and outbuildings are situated on 25 acres. It's been traditionally recognized as the federal-style brick home and tobacco plantation of U.S. Supreme Court Associate Justice Gabriel Duval from as early as 1813. Multiple generations of enslaved families, including the Butlers and the Duval family, navigated citizenship and personhood to the end of the 19th century at Marietta. Marietta House Museum is dedicated to exploring and expanding representations of the tensions among historical voices of generations of individuals and families enslaved by Gabriel Duval and his descendants. Their stories of achievements and afflictions compel visitors to ask, what were the challenges and systemic constraints that shaped the lives lived? As a public history site, Marietta is committed to co-curating discussions, exhibitions, and programs with broad community input. Marietta's goal is to purposefully amplify marginalized voices from the past and present to interpret the historical architecture and landscape across Maryland through authentic history to inspire social equity universally. To tell you about the Giving Voice initiative, I have the pleasure of introducing Prince George's County Parks and Recreation's Natural History Resources Division Assistant Division Chief, Omar Eaton Martinez. Omar, along with Christine Banning, NERD Division Chief, envisioned Marietta House Museum for the Giving Voice initiative. In addition to leading the history facilities for NERD, Omar is the American Alliance of Museums Diversity, Equity, Accessibility, and Inclusion Senior Fellow and serves on the Maryland Lynching Truth and Reconciliation Commission. He's nationally recognized for his work building coalitions that support diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion. Omar has worked at the National Park Service and the Office of the National Museum of the American Latino Commission. It's my pleasure to introduce Omar Eaton Martinez.
Hello, good afternoon, everybody. I'm so excited that everybody's here for our launch for the Giving Voice initiative. You know, it's been like a year in the making in the sense that when Christine Fanning, our division chief, and I had an opportunity to hire a new manager. And when we were envisioning what we could do to build off the great work of the predecessor, we thought about the rich history of the site, and not just of the things that occurred on that nervous landscape, but also the fact that it's connected to an associate Supreme Court justice. And a lot of our work has been focused around justice and giving voice and giving sight to the unseen and giving voice to the unheard. And so we decided to really start to formulate this idea of what it could be to have a Giving Voice initiative that would now shape not only how we partner and how we interpret, but how we do that with the community in a co-creative spirit. And so we went out to go out and recruit for this great leader. We were just really happy to get a lot of great applicants, but certainly one rose to the top, and that was Dr. Julie Rose. And she has taken this initiative and she has brought it to life. And this launch that you guys are part of, this event that you are witnessing and really participating in, is the first manifestation of this. We were able to work under her leadership to create a community advisory board that's helped shape a lot of the initiative in terms of its mission and vision and things that are coming in the future. But really what we're excited about is to really expand the way that we partner, and not just inviting people for a program here or inviting people who are experts in this, but really to cast a wider net in the type of audiences that we're trying to reach. And so I'm super excited this time is finally here, and we're rising above and plowing through these intersecting pandemics of COVID-19 and the latest wave of racial injustices. And we really want to be a beacon of light to the communities that we are serving. And so with that being said, I wanted to introduce our Director of Parks and Recreation, and that is Bill Tyler. Bill Tyler has been the director for just over a year now. And he came and he has guided us through all of this muck and muddle of these intersecting pandemics. And he's been very supportive of the work we've done in our Parks and Recreation Department. And we're glad that he's here supporting the great work of PG Parks history, especially here at the Marietta House Museum, as we embark on this great journey with the Giving Voice initiative. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and spotlight Bill and ask him to unmute.
All right, did I get it? Am I there?
You are in, sir. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, and good afternoon, but thank you, Omar, for that wonderful introduction. And I just have to say, I too am extremely excited about today's program. As Omar mentioned, I'm Bill Tyler, Director of the Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission, Department of Parks and Recreation. And it is my pleasure to speak with you very briefly this afternoon as we all wait in anticipation for this wonderful program. There's almost nothing more personal than your racial and ethnic identity. The Giving Voice initiative supports the vision for Marietta House Museum as a community-driven historic site committed to nurturing, educating, communicating, and bringing to the forefront the varied histories that make up our communities. Using this knowledge, they're creating a platform for social justice advocacy through understanding. This historic site is taking up the mantle to engage the community, including families, school groups, tourists and conversations, interactive history programs, and processes of education and awareness that supports an informed picture of the history of Prince George's County and the history of people of color in America. We are pleased that Dr. Kearse and Ms. Adams are able to join us this afternoon, and I'm looking forward to hearing from Dr. Kearse and her insights and collective knowledge on this significant topic in African-American history and culture. I also look forward to the engaging discussion following her remarks led by Ms. Adams. The Marietta House Museum has opened its doors to give voice to this community, and I so look forward to hearing it. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Omar and Bill. We really appreciate that, and for your kind remarks. We appreciate your support and the liberty to take risks and do things different as a historic house museum. So thank you so much for your commitment to letting us try new things here at Marietta House Museum and for the Giving Voice Initiative. And with that, it is my pleasure to introduce today's featured speakers. Dr. Kearse's book came to my attention through Smithsonian Magazine. I was looking for current literature to read that would shed more light on Marietta's history. Her new book, subject of tonight's program, was even more than about historical ties to Marietta, more profoundly and about intergenerational knowledge about history and family, the essence of the Giving Voice Initiative. Special thanks to Marvin Alonzo Greer for introducing me to Dr. Bettye Kearse. Bettye Kearse is a writer and retired pediatrician living in Santa Fe, Mexico. Her essays and personal narratives have appeared in the Boston Herald, River Teeth, Zora, Image Makers and Influencers, Op-Eds, Mental Floss, Time Magazine, and the anthology Black Lives Have Always Mattered. She's a descendant of the enslaved cook, Corrine, and Corrine's enslaver, and half-brother President James Madison. In March 2020, Houghton Mifflin Harcourt published her memoir, The Madisons, The Lost History of a President's Black Family. In this deeply personal memoir, Dr. Kearse reveals the obstacles, internal and external, she confronted while becoming her family's oral historian, one determined to tell the whole story. The Other Madisons earned an International Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society's Book Award for nonfiction and was listed by Smithsonian Magazine as one of the top 10 best history books of 2020. I'd also like to introduce Melanie Adams. The American Association for State and Local History is among the premier professional associations for public historians, and that's where I met Melanie Adams. Her creative and compelling interpretation strategies to engage communities in dialogue about and for history made Melanie the ideal discussant for the Giving Voice Initiative launched tonight. Dr. Melanie Adams currently serves as the director of the Smithsonian Anacostia Community Museum. Before joining the Smithsonian, Dr. Adams served as the deputy director for learning initiatives at the Minnesota Historical Society, overseeing the state's 26 historic sites. Prior to Minnesota, she spent 12 years at the Missouri Historical Society as the managing director for community education and events. Dr. Adams is an active member of the museum community and served on the board of the American Association for State and Local History and is former president of the Association of Midwest Museums. Ladies and gentlemen, pleased to introduce Bettye Kearse and Melanie Adams.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Julia, for that wonderful introduction. And I think we are kind of ready to get going and show you this wonderful video and have a wonderful conversation here. So I think what we're going to do, we're going to start with Dr. Kearse talking a little bit about the book, so you'll be able to get a little bit of some context before we dive right into the video. So I will turn it over to her.
Thank you, Melanie. It is quite an honor to be part of the Giving Voices initiative. And what Julie didn't say during the introduction, she mentioned Marvin Alonzo Greer, but she didn't say that we found out that we're actually distant cousins. So we have some similarities on our family tree. But let me tell you a little bit about my book and how I came to write it and a little bit about who I am. I'm an American griot, which is a female griot. And griots and griots are oral historians in the ancient West African tradition. For thousands of years, generations of griots and griots have spoken the stories of their ancestors and the history of their people. This tradition remains alive in Africa, and even after 2 centuries, nearly 2 centuries of voyages to America through the Middle Passage, it remains alive in many African American homes today. So without this enduring practice, I would not know about the president and his slave. I grew up reciting and trying to live up to my family's 200-year-old credo, which is always remember, you're a Madison. You come from African slaves and a president. Now, this credo began shortly after the end of the War of 1812. Dolly Madison, having learned that one of her nieces was in love with a slave who happened to have been Dolly's husband's and Corinne's son, had decided that she better get rid of this young man, and so she sold him. And as he was being taken away, his mother, Corinne, pleaded with him, always remember, you're a Madison. She hoped that the name would help them find each other someday, but they never saw each other again. But Jim never forgot his mother's words. He passed them on to his children and told them to tell their children and their children's children that they were Madisons. Over the generations, as America changed, words were added and the credo became what it is today. In 1990, when my family's seventh generation family griot, turned over to me the old cardboard box of family memorabilia, I became the 8th generation griot. And when I asked my mother why now, she said simply, I want to give you plenty of time to write the book. I was a pediatrician, so I hadn't quite expected this assignment, but my mother knew that I loved to write. And when she asked me to write this book, her intent was for me to record the family stories in order to preserve them. She was concerned that as time went on and what our ancestors had endured during slavery and what her grandfather, father, and she herself had endured during Jim Crow, it would become part of the distant past and our family would become comfortable with our lives and forget our history. But she also had the sense that now was the time for our family's story to become part of America's story. So I want to read just a little bit from the book. This is the beginning of chapter 3. And it reads, though 4 inches taller than my mother, I felt small next to her. We sat on the sofa, the box between us. Mom leaned back into the pillows, her slender hands delicate, their joints and veins forming intricate angles and planes in her translucent skin. The woman at my side was much more than my mother. She was a woman of ancient times, passing on a legacy for future generations. As she spoke, I reached for her hand and held on to it. Always remember, you're a Madison. You come from African slaves and a president, she said. Her thin, high-pitched voice resonated through my living room, repeating the words I had heard so many times. each word lingering with a hint of a Texan drawl. Exactly 30 years ago, she said, when my daddy was very ill, he made me the griot. It tired him out, but over 3 days, he told me all the stories, the ones passed down to him and the ones about his own life. Then at the end of the third day, he reminded me that our history goes well beyond America's boundaries. What we believe in and what is important to us come from the vastly different beliefs and values people hold in Europe and Africa. And this, she said, searching my eyes, is very important, Bettye. Each griot in our family has to understand that the other Madisons might struggle sometimes to know how to live our lives. But when we share our stories, we build a sense of togetherness, and we learn who we are. The Other Madisons, The Lost History of a President's Black Family, recounts the struggles, perseverance, and contributions of 8 generations of my family. And it illustrates that enslaved people were remarkable individuals who possessed inner strength and a sense of hope by which they survived, and many talents by which they contributed tremendously to America. And then they passed down those same talents to their descendants. The Other Madisons is a very personal memoir, but I am so pleased when readers tell me that it reminds them of stories about their own ancestors and encourages them to try to learn more about those men and women. I met filmmaker Eduardo Montes Bradley at Montpelier. We were working on the preparations for the permanent exhibit there. It's called A Mere Distinction of Color. And this exhibit is intended to show visitors how enslaved people lived at Montpelier, but also how important they were to the success of not just the plantation, but of the Madisons, particularly of James Madison Jr., who would become the 4th president. So after Eduardo read my book, he sent me an email saying, "Do you want to make a movie?" Which kind of took me by surprise, and I had to think about it for a moment. And I'm so glad I said yes. The film you're about to see is a wonderful extension of my book. It places my family's unique story into the broader historical context within which it developed, and it shows why it is relevant today and why oral history is so important. Please enjoy the film.
The first horn lifts its arm over the dew-lit grass, and in the slave quarters there is a rustling. Children are bundled into aprons, cornbread and water gourds grabbed, a salt pork breakfast taken. I watch them driven into the vague before dawn while their mistress sleeps like an ivory toothpick and Massa dreams of asses, rum, and slave funk. I cannot fall asleep again. At the second horn, the whip curls across the backs of the laggards, sometimes my sister's voice, unmistaken among them. "Oh, pray," she cries, oh pray. Those days I lie on my cot, shivering in the early heat, and as the fields unfold to whiteness and they spill like bees among the fat flowers, I weep. It is not yet daylight.
Well, there's quite a story about my family, where they came from. And actually, we did not start out in Oakland. And my family started out in Ghana, West Africa, if we want to go back to the first of our ancestors in this country. And her name was Mandy. And Mandy was a young woman when she was captured from the shore near her village when she was alone. And so an amazing part of our family story, and probably many other African American family stories, is that they survived the Middle Passage. And then they had to survive the breaking in period, not just physically, but also emotionally, as they had to adapt to becoming an enslaved person where they had been free in Africa. Often when I would get fidgety, especially while she was trying to get me to stand still as she made fancy dresses for my piano recitals, my mother would bring out the box of family memorabilia and pull out items and tell me stories. Even before she started telling the stories, she would admonish me with our family credo, which has guided us for some 200 years. She would say, always remember, you're a Madison. You come from African slaves and a president. By repeating the credo at such times, she was telling me how proud she was of our ancestors, both white and black. But she was also letting me know how she was expecting me to behave. And the reasons were supported by those family stories that she was getting ready to tell me.
They can't tell you the name of the ship their ancestors came over on. They can't tell you the name of the village they were taken from. They probably can't tell you the names of the plantations that their families worked on, unless those plantations somehow, survived into their oral history, because that's how so much of these families' stories have been preserved, is through the oral tradition that they've passed down from family member to family member. And that's what Betty's doing. She's the griot. She's the caretaker of her family's history.
According to the griot and griot tradition of my family, after Mandy was sold, she came to James Madison Sr.'s plantation.
When Mandy was purchased, probably in Fredericksburg, that would have been the closest slave market that James Madison Sr. was frequenting, I imagine. When Mandy was purchased, she would have been put in a wagon, potentially with other people. We don't have any records of when she might have come to the plantation, or whether it was by herself or with a group of other people. But we certainly know that Madison Sr. was buying enslaved people through the 40s, 50s, 60s.
Glory to the Lamb, hallelujah, I'm staying bound for the promised land.
And also, according to the family oral tradition, Mandy was put in a remote cotton field so that she would be away from most of the activity of this huge tobacco plantation. And it was there that James Madison Sr. first saw her and became attracted to her. And the way the story is told is that he became attracted to her because she could pick cotton so fast.
When she arrived at the plantation, think about the culture shock that would have been for her. Here's like, probably the biggest house in the county is Madison's home. It's this massive brick mansion, much different than anything she's seen. Fields and fields of tobacco and corn, wheat, blacksmith operation, the forges pounding away. How different would that have been from her village in Ghana, in the Bight of Benin? There's actually a real similarity in the geography of Virginia and those countries that lie in the Bight, and there's a similarity between the forest and between the rolling hills and between the red clay soil that exists in both places. But the difference between her village and this plantation would have been immense. And of course, the biggest difference is that she was totally under the thumb of the person who owned her. And she went from living a life of complete freedom to a life with none. And she was about to find out just how little freedom and how little choice she would have.
I don't know exactly what happened. And I don't know whether or not there was assault, any form of violence, or if it was coercion, an effort to survive, an effort not to be punished in some sort of way, beaten, starved, or sold away. She was among the most vulnerable human beings in the world, and James Madison Sr. was among the most powerful human beings in the world. Wealthy, well-established Virginia planter. He had power. James Madison Sr.'s attention, that the attention that he paid to her, led to the birth of a daughter whose name was Corinne. Corinne initially started picking cotton as a young girl, but later she was chosen to work in the kitchen.
So the Madisons had two kitchens underneath their duplex, their historic duplex, but they also had a kitchen outside, which I hear Montpelier is reconstructing, which is fantastic. And kitchens were typically moved outside. It started happening in these larger plantation homes right about the time where a lot of the enslaved were coming over and replacing the labor of the indentured white laborers. And so when you see the influx and the rise of enslaved Africans coming into the colony, and you see a decline of the white indentured servants, you see a separation of space within those homes. And the kitchens then began moving outside, not for fear of fire or heat. It was because of the need to sort of differentiate space and race during this period. Karine, as an enslaved chef at a prominent house in Virginia, would have had different treatment than some of the folks in the field. And of course, this depended on the plantation that you were on. But typically, if you were an enslaved cook working inside of that house, you would have more power than anybody else. You know, you were able to poison the person that enslaved you. And there's been several cases of enslaved cooks poisoning their enslaver, and whether it was intentional or they just left the food out too long is still sort of left to be determined. But that power that they had was something that was very much unique to the enslaved chef.
Well, I think the connection I have to the my enslaved ancestors began to become stronger during the Civil Rights Movement and the Black Power movement. And I mean, I think the whole country, especially, you know, the African American communities throughout the country, became more and more aware of their African roots. You know, we were wearing dashikis and afros and shouting Black Power. You know, it was a very unique time. And I think just now we're beginning to become more and more aware of the contributions that the enslaved people made. Many of us are becoming able to take pride in our ancestors, our enslaved ancestors. And I think that we're beginning to recognize that enslaved people had remarkable inner strength and a sense of hope. Otherwise, they would not have been able to survive.
Mandy worked based on Bettye's oral history that she's preserved and has been passed on through the family is in the kitchen. And the kitchen at Montpelier, the main kitchen throughout the 18th and early 19th century into the 1820s at least. And that's the area we've done archaeology on over the past decade and actually reconstructed the buildings. And in fact, the South Kitchen is what we call it. The South Kitchen today is literally being rebuilt from the ground right now.
So historic sites and plantations that interpret slavery have really come a long way. I think that it is incredibly important, though, visitors be able to empathize to some kind of degree about what it must have been like. Something about what it might have been like to live every day with the knowledge that your loved one could be sold and that you would never see them again. I also think that it is important to reconstruct slave dwellings based on really careful study and analysis and archaeological excavation. Because for a person to be able to walk into a space and feel that space in relationship to their own bodies, that is so much more impactful than just, you know, reading about it.
And I'm glancing over here at the excavation of the kitchen. So I'm actually able to look at where she worked and just see the surrounding area and see some of the same things that she once saw. From the moment I told her my family's story, she was excited by it. And they had just discovered this kitchen, and she said, you're an outsider, but I'm going to show you something special. And she took me to see the foundation of the kitchen, which was just sort of a rectangle of bricks with a pile of more bricks at one end, which was the cooking hearth. And she pulled back some of the blue tarp that was there. And, so I was able to see something real. And what else was real was at that time, there was a groove in the ground that led from the kitchen to the back of the mansion that had been worn there by generations of slaves walking to and from the kitchen to serve the Madisons. And I was able to actually walk in that groove. So I was literally able to walk in my own ancestors' footsteps. It's incredible. Yeah, that was an incredible experience.
My friend, I want to call your attention to the 8th chapter of the Gospel according to St. Luke and the 22nd verse. It came to pass on the certain day that he went out into a ship with his disciples and said unto them, let us go over on the other side of the lake. And they launched forth. But as they sailed, he fell asleep. And there came down a storm, a wind on the lake, and they were filled with water.
African Americans from the time of slavery through right now have made major contributions to this country. And James Madison in particular, without the luxuries that slave labor offered him, he would not have been able to go off to the College of New Jersey or whatever they called Princeton at that time and learn about the great political philosophers to formulate the ideas that are the basis for the United States Constitution. And without that Constitution, this nation would have failed. Well, I imagine her as beautiful, with rich, dark skin, perfect, smooth, beautiful skin. I imagine her body as being kind of sinewy and strong. And I imagine her having lots of red beads in her hair before she came to America and ended up with just one bead in her hair that she cherished for the rest of her life.
Baptized with the Holy Ghost, my life it to been clean. Lord Jesus, reign within.
For the past 20 years, since May of 2000, I've been the Director of Archaeology at Montpelier. And pretty much from the day I arrived at Montpelier, been interested in seeing how archaeology can bear witness to the enslaved ancestors of the larger Montpelier descendant community. With the material remains, the household broken items, the pottery, the ceramics, sometimes even bits of cufflinks and clothing that were left behind by the ancestors of Montpelier descendants. And with working with the descendant community, like with Bettye, all of a sudden these pieces, these fragments of the past come to life, because to work with descendants and you're finding their ancestor remains, the material remains from their households. And in some cases, you're not finding them as archaeologists, you're working with the descendants who are finding them themselves. They're the ones who are holding them in their hands. It is just mind-blowing, to be able to witness that and to connect the descendants with their ancestors past. And all of a sudden, you're helping to make their ancestors, who they don't know necessarily, in some cases Bettye does, but in other cases they don't know their names and certainly don't have photographs. All of a sudden you're able to make their ancestors real.
Just like the light of gold.
Great. Well, thank you so much. We are stopping the video now. We did about 20 minutes. And so I have a series of questions we're going to use as our discussion kickoff. But I do encourage you. I love how everyone is putting comments in the chat. So we will be looking at the chat as well. And we'll then do another about 7 to 10 minutes of the video, a couple of more questions, then we'll open it up and take questions from the audience. So I think my first question, Bettye, why was it important for you to go to the places that make up your family history in both Africa and the United States? So we know, obviously, Mount Pelier wasn't the only place you went. Talk a little bit about the other places you went and why that was important.
Well, all of my trips were intended to help me to understand what slavery was, and just to try to get a concept of people owning people. But I also wanted to get to know my own ancestors. So my journey actually began and ended at Montpelier. But I went to Lagos, Portugal, because that's where the transatlantic slave trade began. I went to Ghana, West Africa, because that's where my family's first African ancestor in America was born. And also she was our first griot. And I went to Baltimore, Maryland, because there is a replica of a slave ship, very much like the one that would have carried my ancestor and many other ancestors of other families from Africa to America. I went to Central Texas because that was where my great-great-grandparents and their 8 sons learned they were free. I went to New York City because I wanted to learn about burial practices, among Africans in this country. And round trip back to Montpelier. But really the effort was to get to see what my ancestors had seen and maybe walked where they had walked, just to sort of, become closer to them. And there's nothing like a sense of place, like actually being there. You can read about, but until you're actually there, there's a big difference.
And I think that comes across so wonderfully in the documentary where you talk about what it was like to walk in the grooves where you knew your ancestors had walked.
Yes. Yeah, that was just an amazing experience. I mean, how many people really know that you're walking where your ancestors actually walked?
Right. Wonderful.
That really brought me closer to her. That was Corinne.
Well, one of the things that's mentioned in the documentary is the Middle Passage. And a lot of times we'll think of the Middle Passage as really one of the first stories of resiliency of the African-American community, because just surviving the Middle Passage was important. So how does sharing of your family stories contribute to the resiliency of the culture, of keeping the culture alive? And then how did this help you better understand the lives of enslaved people? And I'm happy to re-ask that second question after the first one again. So the first one was, how does your sharing of your family stories contribute to the resiliency of the African-American culture?
And, you mentioned the Middle Passage. That was a real testing ground. It went on for weeks, sometimes even months at a time, enduring rats crawling across your body, people dying all around you, people ill, and people just losing everything that they had known and everyone they had loved. I mean, here they are in the middle of this vast ocean, not knowing where they were going, not having any idea of what to expect. And they got through it. And I think that part of the reason, a large part of the reason they got through it is because they were able to call on their own humanity, to call on their own sense of strength, their determination not to be destroyed, and to somehow meet whatever challenge the next day brought to them. And I believe that those same qualities are passed down to us today.
Well, and I think one of our audience members mentioned, she says, please don't forget Africans fed everyone too, not just allegedly poisoned white people. And I think the context, and correct me if I'm wrong, the context around the poisoning really did speak to this idea of resiliency and the ability to actively find ways to resist. So of course we know that enslaved people fed everyone on the plantation, but talking about the potential of poisoning their slave owners really talked about their way of resisting their own enslavement.
Well, yes, in a way it was resisting their own enslavement, not just by killing off those who were enslaving, but also nurturing themselves and supporting each other and strengthening that bond of community. Yes, they had inner strength, they had their own individual strengths, but they also had a very strong sense of community, which was, based on the African communities that they had come from. So, they knew how to pull together.
So how did all of this help you better understand the lives of enslaved people? So walking where they walked, going to Africa in different locations, were there some things that you learned or really helped you better understand it, as you said, by being in the place they were and kind of making maybe the decisions that had to be made? But what type of understanding did you get as you researched your family history and visited these different places?
Well, I came to understand that our ancestors had a sense of their place in the human landscape and their place in the world landscape. And it goes down through the levels of being, if you will, to an individual level. We have a place, and we're going to hang on to it. We're going to nurture it. We're going to use it for ourselves and for others. Did I answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
So why is it important to share family history, and how does it impact future generations? And I ask that because I think we all remember when we were younger and, we're like, oh, not that story again. And then you hit that age where you're like, I really want to hear that story now. So how do you get, maybe I'll shift the question a little bit. How do you get the younger generation to be interested? Like, I love that your mother said, okay, I'm giving you this information now because you're going to write the book. But how do you share this with future generations if you're not going to write a book?
Well, you don't have to write a book, but it is, I would recommend that you write some things down, or a lot of things down, but you don't have to write a book. That's quite a process in itself. But it is important for our children to learn from an early age that they come from some really special people. And if these people could endure being stolen and sold and starved and beaten and just generally uprooted and with an effort to make them subservient, if our ancestors could endure that, we can endure some of the things that we're enduring today. So my grandfather used to say that racism is just a feeble leftover of slavery. And, and I think that does put things into perspective. I mean, racism is horrible. It's harmful. It can be devastating, but and I hate to sound like I might be minimizing it. And I truly don't mean to do that. But it's a different scale compared to what our ancestors endured, and they did endure it. Otherwise, we wouldn't be the people we are today.
Well, and I think it's also just so important for younger generations to learn this history, because unfortunately, like when I was in school, this is not how slavery was taught. It was a very different narrative. And so I think it's important for people to be able to hear their family narratives and stories of resilience, stories of advocacy, stories that show, again, that we do come from a strong people and that we will endure. So that's another kind of great reason to make sure we're telling these stories. So you've mentioned your grandfather's credo a few different times. So can you talk about, or your family credo, sorry, a few different times. Can you talk about the importance of your grandfather's addition to the family credo? So remind people again what the original family credo was, and then your grandfather's addition.
Okay, I'll give you the whole evolution
Okay, yes.
of the credo, because there were actually 3 credos. The first credo I did mention, and that is always remember you're a Madison. And at that time, this is when Corinne's son was sold away from her, and she hoped that the name could help them find each other someday. So she was just concerned about preserving the name as a tool. But over the generations, as America changed, the credo changed to meet the different demands and needs of each era. And so after my enslaved ancestors were freed, the name could just be more than a tool to find torn away loved ones. Then it could become a source of inspiration. And so my great-great-grandfather, Emmanuel, turned the credo to always remember you're a Madison. You come from a president. So he wanted his children to make the most of their legacy. I mean, you come from a president, you're going to make use of that special legacy. And they did. They built homes, they had businesses, they became ministers, they worked in the community. They were indeed inspired. And then my grandfather, who was born free, was proud that his father, his grandfather, and other enslaved ancestors had overcome enslavement. And so he wanted his children to embrace their slave ancestry. And so he added the words African slaves. So it is now, for the last 4 generations, I'm losing track of it, but since my grandfather, it is always remember you're a Madison. You come from African slaves and a president.
So great, thank you. Well, I think we will turn it back over and watch the final 7 minutes of the video. Then we have a few more questions before we open it up to the chat area. So please enjoy this final section of the documentary.
So after the Civil War, the name was no longer needed as a tool to find torn away loved ones. And now the name could be a source of pride. So Jim's son, Emmanuel, my great-great-grandfather, taught his children to be proud that their name had belonged to a president, and to make the most of that legacy now that they had the chance. So he added to the Credo, and it became, always remember, you're a Madison. You come from a president. And that was the Credo for the next 2 generations until my grandfather, my beloved Gramps, who was born free. He was Emmanuel's grandson. He was proud that his father and grandfather and other enslaved ancestors had overcome enslavement. So Gramps added 2 important words, African slaves. So the Credo became, always remember, you're a Madison. You come from African slaves and a president. So for the last 100 years, the Credo has reminded us that we're not just descendants of a president, we're descendants of enslaved people too.
You know, while we don't have marked graves of the ancestors at Montpelier, like with tombstones with names and dates, we have found the ancestral cemetery of the enslaved Americans who lived, worked, and died at Montpelier. And we've found it all in one spot. It's one area that for years, earlier archaeologists had found these depressions in the ground. And originally it was thought there was maybe 38 to 45 graves in this one area, but we've recently done ground penetrating radar. And what we discovered is there are hundreds of graves in this location. And what it makes us realize, it's this spot that's not just down the hill from the main house is probably where any member of the enslaved community during the Madison era who passed away was buried there.
We will march through the valley in peace.
When enslaved individuals died, somewhat paradoxically, that was one of the moments where the enslaved community had the most control over their lives. So through death, they controlled their day, that ceremony, that ritual. And enslaved people didn't always have control over their daily rituals. But with funerals, most slave owners, not all, but most, did not interfere with mortuary rituals, as far as we can tell.
We will walk here together in peace.
So for an enslaved individual, when they died, whoever their close family were, hopefully were at hand. And I say hopefully because in some cases, the enslaved families had been separated over distance from sales, but your closest relatives would come to care for the body, undress the body, clean the body. This was work that was often done by women, and lay the body out. Especially in the South, you wanted to bury the body as soon as possible. Very often then that evening, you would move to bury the body, but the funeral itself might occur days, weeks, months later, when people from different plantations and other enslaved communities were able to get word of the death and were able to travel to that plantation. And as you can imagine,
it's about a CVS pharmacy.
Events that I'm saying as if enslaved people had control of their daily lives, the reason why it worked is because these funerals, these memorials, these commemorative events were often held at night, and very often at midnight, in fact, when enslaved people, for the most part, were not in the fields working or not in the houses working and had some control over their own lives.
As I mentioned before, enslaved people were remarkable human beings who had inner strength and sense of balance and a sense of hope, and they had many talents, and they contributed mightily to this country. But I think it's important for us to remember today that when slaves died, they didn't take those qualities to the grave with them.
Freedom. Freedom.
They passed them on to their descendants, including those of us alive today. So including me, including my daughter, Nicole, including my 2 grandchildren,
Justice.
one of whom is named Madison.
We don't get it. Shut it down. If you don't get it, shut it.
So it'd be 10 generations for Madison and Peter. But those qualities are still with them. And those qualities are still with other African Americans and the generations to come, as long as we remember our enslaved ancestors. And really, that's why the griot tradition is so important.
And another thing that I remember on the plantation that we haven't mentioned before was the churn song. Little Emma, the baby's nurse, after the baby was tucked in bed, was often called in the kitchen to do the churning. And this is a song that she sang to the milk. Come, butter, come, mister standing at the gate, waiting for the butter cake to come, butter, come. Come, butter, come, mistress a-waiting. Come, butter, come, mistress a-waiting. Come, butter, come, the missus a-waiting. Come, butter, come, the missus a-waiting. Missus a-waiting for the butter cake to come, butter, come. Come, butter, come, missus a-waiting. Missus a-waiting for the butter cake to come, butter, come. Missus a-waiting. Come, butter, come, the missus a-waiting. And this chant would go on through until the churning was finished, and the rich golden butter would come into a solid cake on the top of the milk.
Great. Well, we will go into a few more questions before we open it up to the audience. So let's talk a little bit about historic sites, and as we know, how they should and could be reaching out to families, because I think your story serves as a great model for how this can be done. So the question is essentially, what is the best way for historic sites to begin working with descendant families to build their trust? Because we know that's really important.
Mm-hmm. I am certainly most familiar with Montpelier, right, but I imagine that most other plantations, particularly those who once belonged to presidents, have some of the same issues. Right. And that is that there's a great deal of resentment and distrust and anger. What certainly happened to their ancestors, who may have died before they knew them, but could have happened to the ancestors whom they did know, and could have happened to themselves as well. There's just, I mentioned Jim Crow and the aftermath of that, and those kinds of experiences are not quickly forgotten, even by those people who did not live them themselves. So that anger, resentment, lack of trust is passed down. And I think that the best way to begin to work towards a resolution of those feelings is to reach out in a very respectful and inclusive way, and to invite the community to be part of whatever decision making is underway. But probably more important is to give them some positions of authority within whatever body is working toward this effort. Now, I'm a member of the Montpelier Descendant Committee, and those are our goals. And I don't know if other plantations have similar groups or not, but I think reaching out, being inclusive, being respectful, giving real credence to their opinions and needs is very important.
Right. And I think you kind of hit it on the head there when you said, give them authority, because I think I'll speak just as a museum professional, that is one of those things that's really hard to give up. When you're trained as a museum professional, the sense of authority usually sits with the curator. And I think what we're learning as we continue to work with communities is really that the lived experience, the community stories, the oral traditions are just as important as whatever interpretation or story that we're trying to tell as a historic site.
Yeah, I think the attitude should not be do for,
right,
but do with.
Right. So not everyone can have their family story told at a large national historic site. So what does that mean to you to know that hundreds of thousands of visitors kind of hear your family's story every day as they go through the historic site?
Well, it is really pretty wonderful. It's really quite an honor. And I first went to Montpelier in 1992. Mm-hmm. And, they welcomed me then and they welcomed me now. So what's that? Almost 30 years. Yes. And I think they see me as a source of I almost said inspiration, but maybe that would be nice, but source of information. And, it's been a give and take. Mm-hmm. And I actually am in the permanent exhibit, A Mere Distinction of Color. And, that is just such an honor to be taken that seriously. This is a permanent exhibit that thousands of visitors see and will be there probably as long as Montpelier is there, which is a very long time. And so my story is an example of how important enslaved people were to the Madisons, to the plantation, and especially at this site, at the home of the father of the Constitution, how important we were to the fact that that Constitution even got written. Because if it had, as I said in the video, if Madison had to work the fields himself, right, he couldn't have gone off to Princeton right. University and studied, the great political philosopher that led to his developing the foundation for our Constitution.
Right. So I know you got to do something that not a lot of people do, which was experience a dig on a historic site. So can you talk a little bit about that experience?
Oh, that was so much fun. First of all, though, you have to like getting dirty.
Right.
You get really, really dirty. But what was so wonderful about it is that you actually go into the ground, where real people had walked, where real people had worked. And the site that I was involved in, it was the, what do you call it? It's sort of, what, oh my gosh. But anyway, it was where enslaved people threw things that they were done with. Mm-hmm. And so there were all kinds of things in there, and you could dig up fragments of a plate And, you know, and it was just such an exciting thing to find maybe an inch square piece of pottery, because you know that an enslaved person had held that pottery and had at one point cherished it until it was no longer of use to them. And I was so impressed with how the staff involved us. We were trained, the staff kept us involved at every step. So we were out there in the ground, you know, digging up dirt, getting dirty ourselves. We were involved in sorting the pieces and putting them through. I think they're like sieves, kind of, to sort out different sizes of fragments, pieces of metal, pieces of glass, and storing them. You know, it's a very meticulous, painstaking process, but it's very rewarding. And you keep digging long enough, you find enough pieces to actually put something together, and like a cup or whatever. And, you know, that one, a slave once used, an enslaved person. And you know what, I want the audience to recognize that I'm correcting myself. So I said a slave. I think it's a much better term to say an enslaved person, or an enslaved individual, or a person held in bondage.
Bondage, right.
Yes.
So no, but I think that's wonderful, the story about the archaeology, because that is something that usually we don't think about, and how much those artifacts can tell you about people's everyday lives. And we think of these larger artifacts that people want to find, but it really is these everyday objects that gives us an idea into their lives on a daily basis. Let's see, so let's shift a little bit. We only have a few more minutes left before we open it up. But we talked a little bit about the legacy and the continuation of your family history connected to the civil rights movement, in the sense of this extended sense of resistance and agency. So how do you see the telling and recounting of our family stories as a continuation in the movement towards the social justice movements that we're seeing today?
It is through the recognition and honoring of our own sense of humanity, and knowing that we have rights. Even though our ancestors were brought here against our will, we've been here for generations and generations, and have actually created the American landscape. And we have earned rights, but yet we have to fight for them. You know, we've always had to fight for them. And we continue to do so. And I am certain we will continue to fight until we have parity, you know, within this country.
Great, well, thank you. And I wanted to do two quick reminders. We're gonna have two questions. The first one is about how do we access the full documentary film? So will it be screened anywhere? I know they were talking about festivals and things.
I'm not sure how to answer that in this context, because Marietta House does have the full film. And so I perhaps that should be worked out through Marietta House. But certainly, I'm sure Eduardo Montes Bradley, the filmmaker, would love for everyone to see the full film. And if I can help in any way, I'd certainly be happy to.
Right, and we only missed about 9 minutes of it. So the whole film was, I think, 36 minutes. So you missed about 9. Let's see, as we're looking at other questions are starting to come in. So can you tell people how they can purchase the book?
Well, the book is available at from all online booksellers. And it's in your independent local bookstore. That's a great place to obtain one. Does Marietta House have a bookstore? but I don't know if there's some way of purchasing it.
We don't have a bookstore, Betty, but I myself was able to purchase it on Amazon.com, and it was really easy. And other booksellers, national and small bookstores as well. It's a very popular book, so I think folks shouldn't have too much trouble getting their hands on it. I have my copy right here on my desk. And in terms of making the video available, that will be another opportunity for us to, during COVID times, to make another program that, people can certainly sign in to watch. And I will talk with Eduardo to see what that might all entail. So thank you for thinking of that so much. Thank you.
Great.
But I still encourage everyone to try to use your independent bookstores, because they've been struggling, especially during the pandemic.
Yes.
And they've given so much to our communities.
And so we have someone who read your book. The question is, in your book, you said that the male Madison descendant alive today changed his mind and would not give a DNA sample. Has he changed his mind again by any chance?
No, he hasn't. And I don't know if that gentleman is still alive or not. My understanding is that he was elderly, and this was, maybe close to 9 or 10 years ago.
Okay. So the question is, how do you feel about enslavers' use of Christianity to oppress? That's kind of a heavy question.
And I'm not a theologian, but and I'm going to enter some deep water here, but the Bible has been manipulated in ways to serve whatever purposes people want to use it. So it has been interpreted and reinterpreted, but enslavers used the Bible to teach their enslaved people to be subservient and obedient. But what they didn't know is when the enslavers turned their backs, the enslaved people turned it around and empowered themselves with the messages from the Bible. They got that real preaching going.
And I think that's also such a great example, again, around the power of literacy. And there was a reason why they did not want enslaved people to learn how to read, because then they would be able to read the text for themselves and interpret what is being said. And so someone said she thought it was great that you brought up the term enslaved individual versus slave. So, and this may be a question more as a writer, the importance of language there. Did you struggle as you were writing this book, like over every word and how it would be interpreted and analyzed and used?
Absolutely, every word. And there's nothing like rewriting until you are certain that the words you're putting down on the paper are exactly what you were intending to say.
Let's see, do people have other questions? We're getting a lot of things in the chat, giving us other options to buy the book. I'm sorry to say, Anacostia, we don't have a bookstore, or we don't have a gift shop, so we can't sell it, but it looks like we have a lot of great examples here as well. It seems like a lot of people are saying they've learned a lot during this program. As always, people are saying, they're Virginians and this is the first time they're hearing this story. So I was going to ask you, I'm glad you said that the first time you went to Montpelier was in 1992. And you're saying you were well received, because I always think of during the early 90s, and I went to school at UVA, so I was right there near Monticello. These weren't the narratives they were telling at those sites in the early 90s. So you found them to be very open in terms of hearing your story.
Oh, very open. I think part of it, the timing was just right. They had just, the archaeologists had just discovered the South Kitchen, which is about 70 feet away from the mansion. So they were excavating that kitchen, and they knew this was where enslaved people had worked. And when I come along and said, well, my great, 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 great grandmother was an enslaved cook here, they were excited. You know, I knew someone had worked in this site, but that they were just uncovering.
Ah, so
and we have another question here in the chat. Marvin Alonso, he says there was a division of Jefferson and his children. Have you received pushback on our family's history?
Researching your own family history and really finding and sharing those stories with your family. Dr. Kearse, do you have any final words you'd like to share?
No, well, actually, I just would like to say that my life's purpose really is through this book to encourage all African Americans, but particularly our young people, to embrace our slave ancestry and to grab onto and nurture those qualities, you know, that we inherited from our enslaved ancestors, you know, such as our inner strength and sense of hope. And sense of hope is a very important one. And, you know, recognize that, you know, that we have talents and not let racism convince them otherwise, which is a problem that I encountered during my 31 years as a pediatrician in inner city Boston, that racism had just created such hopelessness in some of the African American youths.
Great, great. Well, thank you, everyone. I will turn this back over to Julie. I don't know if there's any other parting words that need to happen, or turn it over to Omar, who just came on.
Oh, I just wanted to thank you both again for a tremendous conversation. I mean, we're all overwhelmed with all the points that have been brought up through this great conversation between the documentary and the book, and just being able to allow us to connect with the stories that we're still uncovering, even at Marietta and some of our other sites, has been just a fantastic experience for all of us. So we're hoping that we can build upon this and continue to reach out to the community to get these stories. So I also wanted to thank, you know, our Department of Parks and Recreation Director, Bill Tyler, for spending his time with us and welcoming us. And certainly want to give big thanks to our Division Chief, Christine Fanning, who's been a thought leader with all of us on the Giving Voice Initiative. And we just get so much support from our leadership within the department, within the division, but even in the commission from our chairman, Elizabeth Hewlett, and so many other leaders that we have. So with that being said, I'll pass it on to Dr. Julie Rose.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Bettye and Melanie, for the opportunity to learn with you tonight. Thank you again, Omar and Bill, for your comments tonight. Thank you, Stacy Hawkins, Ray Wallace, and Katie Rice for your assistance throughout this 3-month planning period. We really appreciate that and your work this evening. And I'd like to mention that we have a wonderful program happening in September, on September 11th and 12th. It's a partnership with many of the NERD facilities, led in part by the archaeology department. It's called Echoes of the Enslaved with Joe McGill. There will be a very rich evening campfire conversations with Mayor Dennis Smith, historian Will Thomas, and Joe McGill, and an open conversation with the attendees. It's hybrid. We'll have an in-person component as well as a online component with these conversations about place, about a space here, spaces here at Marietta. People will be able to spend the night. And then in the morning, we will enjoy performance by the Jubilee Singers and an opportunity to, again, talk about what the space means as a place-based interpretation of the enslaved who were here at one time on the grounds that are now Marietta. I would like to especially thank you, the attendees, for your great questions and stimulating comments. We hope this discussion inspired you to consider becoming part of the Giving Voice initiative. We hope this is the first of many more enriching and thought-provoking programs where you'll find ways to be part of the telling and listening to historical voices. Let's work on finding ways to tie them to the present. We open the museum to you to help curate the stories, exhibits, and new strategies for social justice education. Let us know if you'd like to receive a recording of tonight's program, if you'd like to receive the Marietta House Museum newsletter, it's monthly, or if you'd like to propose a project or to share family stories, please reach out to us. Stacy and I are here, and we'd be delighted to get rolling with community projects and individual projects. We're very excited for this evening's program. Thank you so much for being part of tonight's launch.
Thank you.